Our next speaker is Themis Kouliakis. He's going to talk about communication and memory efficient testing of discrete distributions.
Thank you. This is joint work with Elias Diakonikolas, Daniel Kane, and Sarkis Rao. And this course was done while I was a postdoc at the University of Southern California. Okay, so we live in the era of big data, and it's becoming more and more important to be able to do computation in a distributed manner. Yeah, and the reason for that is because a single machine might have insufficient resources to be able to handle certain computation tasks. And so one example of a problem we will be interested in is suppose that you have a probability distribution in a very large domain, and you'd like to determine whether it's uniform or not. For example, this will determine if a lottery is fair, like the distribution has to be uniform. One naive way to do this task would be to actually learn the distribution. However, this is not very efficient because it requires sublinearly. We know that it requires superlinearly many samples. A slightly better way would be to test. So that means distinguish between, by drawing samples from distribution, distinguish between the distribution being uniform versus being epsilon far in total variation distance from uniform. We know that this requires root n over epsilon square samples. But for today's talk, I want to, we're asking, we go even further, and we are asking what happens if even this many samples are not are too many to fit in one machine, and so that we will have to use different machines that communicate with each other to be able to do this task. Okay, so for this problem that I just talked about, over the last 2 decades, there has been a lot of work that have pinned down its sample complexity to this root n over epsilon squared, both upper and lower bounds. Now, what happens when, as I said, when we want to, when we have those constraints? That's why more recently people are interested in performing these learning and testing tasks in a distributed way in various settings. And there are some examples of these works. But I would like to move on to the specific communication model that I'm going to use in this talk. Okay, so suppose that, as I said, we want to solve a statistical problem that involves samples, but we don't have any single machine that can handle the entire size of our sample set. Therefore, we're going to use multiple, like an unbounded number of machines that I call players here, which are the nodes on the left. And so each player has a certain number of samples associated with it, and they can communicate in certain way with each other in order to complete the task. So how can they communicate? One way is that the machines can send messages to a blackboard, which is somewhere where these messages will appear and everyone has access to them, both the players and the referee. And and there's also a referee which asks certain questions to the players and receives answers. And our goal in the end is to answer our question with as few bits of communication as possible. Okay, so let's now take a step back and having this model that I talked about in the back of our heads. Let's see how an algorithm for solving this uniformity testing problem that I talked about might look like. So to remind you, there's a classical algorithm for these tasks that does the following. You just draw a bunch of samples, usually root n square, as I said, is required, and you just count the number of pairwise collisions between the samples and compare this to a threshold. If it's too many, you say that it cannot be uniform. If it's below the threshold, you say it's uniform. Okay? So I would like to tweak this algorithm a little bit. Instead of having a single set of samples, I have 2 sets of samples. And I'm going to create a random bipartite graph in the way that I will describe as follows now. So how do you create this bipartite graph? Suppose that each machine is one of those red ellipses, and there is L sums per machine, and the nodes are the sums that the machine has, and they're IID sums from distribution P. And there will be an edge in the bipartite graph if and only if the two labels on the left and on the right are the same. Okay, note that in you can think of the classical algorithm as this picture, but with a complete graph instead of a bipartite graph. Okay, and so it seems that we're doing something suboptimal here, because in order to have a bipartite graph with the same expected number of edges, we needed to have more nodes, which means more samples. Okay, but we're doing this because this will help us, because our goal is not actually to minimize the sample complexity, as I said, but it's to minimize the communication complexity. And this bipartiteness, as I will explain in the next slide, will help us for this task. Okay, so what we do here again, so our statistic, instead of the number of collisions, so it's basically the number of cross collisions, or equivalent to the number of edges of this bipartite graph. And this is a good statistic because uniform distribution minimizes the number of edges, the expected number of edges. And if it's far from uniform, there's a large enough gap. Okay. So now, how can we exploit this model? Like, how can we do something better in this model? The main idea is that our statistic, as I said, is the number of edges, and you can view this as the sum of the degrees on one side of the graph. Okay. And the main idea is that to be able to compute the statistic, you don't need to know exactly what are the labels of all the nodes in the graph. However, if you just know the labels of the left part explicitly, which takes log n bits per node, the nodes on the right can just compute their degree in the graph, like how many labels they're equal to, and just send their degree, which is much more cheaper. So we'll send the degree to the referee, and the referee can compute the statistic and solve the problem. And this enables us to save a square root of log n factor in the communication complexity compared to what we would get if we did it naively. Okay. So So another thing that I would like to point out is that even though we have we have shown some tightness for certain parameter regimes for L, it turns out that if L grows larger, and by larger I mean larger than n to the 1/3 over epsilon to the 4/3, we can actually have a better algorithm. So the optimal algorithm becomes suboptimal for this parameter. And what does the algorithm look like? I will very quickly say that. So remember the example we have. The classical algorithm is the complete graph. Our communication efficiency is a bipartite graph. This algorithm looks like a union of complete graphs, essentially, because each machine will internally compute its collisions, and the referee just sums them up. I'm running out of time, but if you come to the poster later, we also have some streaming models with limited memory. This is a summary of all the results in the paper. We also have results for closeness and lower bounds for both models, including a reduction that can convert results from one model to the other. And I would like to close with mentioning a couple of operator problems. So it would be interesting to see what happens when, so for our memory, like for our limited memory model, as I said, it's one pass streaming model. It would be interesting to see what what are the answers in multiple passes, and also we would like to better understand the trade-off between communication and sample complexity in the other models. Thank you very much.
We'll take one quick question if anybody has. Okay, let's thank the speaker again.